You've been in that hospital bed for 96 hours. Do you have any idea how much laundry has piled up? Stop pretending you're paralyzed and get in the kitchen. I want the $14 organic Wagyu burgers, medium rare, and I want them now." These were the first words I heard from my brother after I survived a grade 4 ruptured appendix and septic shock. My name is Cassidy Miller. I am 24 years old, and I am a lead surgical scrub nurse. I spend 12-hour shifts at the St. Jude Medical Center in Seattle, Washington, dressed in sterile seal blue scrubs, standing under the blinding LED lights of an operating room where the margin for error is 0. I've held retractors while surgeons repaired shredded aortas, and I've counted every sponge and needle with a precision that borders on the obsessive because a single mistake means a life lost. But when I stepped through the threshold of my own home, a house I pay the $2,800 monthly mortgage on, I was treated like a 24/7 unpaid servant who didn't deserve a chair to sit on. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the 4 days that preceded that moment. Back to the sterile, beep-filled silence of the intensive care unit where I was a patient instead of a practitioner. On a Tuesday evening, after a grueling double shift where I'd assisted in 3 consecutive laparoscopic cholecystectomies, I collapsed in the hospital parking lot next to my 2023 lunar silver metallic Honda Civic. The pain was a white-hot iron being twisted into my lower right quadrant. By the time my own colleagues wheeled me into the emergency department, my appendix had already disintegrated, flooding my abdominal cavity with toxins. I underwent emergency surgery at 11:45 p.m., a procedure that left me with a 6-inch incision closed with 14 stainless steel staples and a drainage tube that felt like a hot wire every time I breathed. For 96 hours, I lay in bed 402 of the surgical recovery wing. My blood pressure had plummeted to 85/50 during septic shock, and my body was fighting a battle I wasn't sure I could win. My parents, Robert and Martha Miller, arrived on the second day. They didn't bring flowers or a card. My mother looked at my IV pole, tracing the line of the vancomycin antibiotic drip, and sighed about how the drive from their suburban home in Bellevue had taken 40 minutes because of the construction on I-5. My father checked his $500 Apple Watch Ultra every 5 minutes, complaining that he was missing his weekly golf tournament at the Broadmoor Golf Club. They stayed for 20 minutes, mostly talking about my older brother, Brandon. Brandon is 27, and in the eyes of my parents, he is a misunderstood genius. To the rest of the world, he is a man who hasn't held a job since he was fired from a junior marketing firm 3 years ago. He spends his days in the finished basement of the house our grandmother left to me, a house my parents insisted he live in, rent-free so he could find his feet. He spends his nights playing high-stakes online poker on a $4,500 custom-built Alienware Aurora R16 gaming PC, fueled by the premium groceries I buy with my overtime pay. When the hospital finally discharged me on Saturday morning, I was weak, pale, and clutching a pillow against my abdomen to keep my internal organs from feeling like they were shifting with every movement. My friend Sarah, a fellow nurse, drove me home. She helped me up the 3 concrete steps of my craftsman-style house on 12th Avenue. The air in the entryway was thick with the smell of stale pizza and the metallic tang of unwashed gym clothes. Sarah offered to stay, to make me some broth or at least clear a path to the sofa, but I told her I would be fine. I just wanted to sleep in a bed that didn't have a plastic mattress cover. I had barely lowered my bruised, aching body onto the gray West Elm sectional sofa when the basement door creaked open. Brandon emerged, wearing a pair of $80 Nike Tech fleece joggers that I had paid for last Christmas. He didn't look at the surgical bandage peeking out from under my sweatshirt. He didn't look at the dark circles under my eyes or the way my hands were shaking. He looked at the empty kitchen counter and then at his watch. That was when he said it. The demand for the $14 Wagyu burgers from the Whole Foods on 28th Street. Not just any burgers, but the organic, grass-fed patties that cost more than a single hour of a CNA's wages. He wanted them medium rare, served with the expensive brioche buns and the aged Gruyere cheese I usually keep in the deli drawer for the rare moments I have time to eat a real meal. I looked at him, my vision blurring slightly from the lingering effects of the anesthesia and the sheer, crushing weight of his entitlement. I could feel the pull of the staples in my skin. Every heartbeat throbbed in my incision. "Brandon," I managed to whisper, my voice raspy from the intubation tube that had been down my throat only 48 hours prior. I almost died. The doctors told me I can't lift anything heavier than a gallon of milk for 6 weeks. I can't stand over a hot stove. He rolled his eyes, a gesture of such practiced nonchalance that it made my blood run cold. He walked over to the pile of laundry overflowing from the wicker basket near the mudroom, a mountain of his discarded hoodies, sweat-wicking gym shirts, and Ralph Lauren socks. "We all have problems, Cass," he snapped, his voice rising in that aggressive pitch he used whenever he felt inconvenienced. "I haven't had a decent meal in 4 days because you weren't here to go to the store. Mom said you were just having a minor procedure. Stop playing the martyr. The laundry is starting to smell, and I've got a tournament starting in 2 hours. Just flip the burgers, throw a load in the Bosch washer, and then you can go back to your little nap." I sat there, frozen, as the silence of the house settled around us, broken only by the hum of the $3,000 Sub-Zero refrigerator I had worked 6 months of night shifts to afford. I looked at the kitchen, the heart of the home I had tried so hard to build. The granite countertops were covered in sticky rings from his Gatorade bottles. The sink was full of crusty dishes, including the expensive Le Creuset Dutch oven he'd used to make boxed mac and cheese, and then left to soak until the water turned gray and slimy. In that moment, something shifted inside me. It wasn't a sudden explosion of rage. It was a cold, surgical clarity. It was the same clarity I felt when a patient's heart stopped on the table and I had to move with clinical efficiency to bring them back. I realized that for 24 years, I had been the reliable one. I was the daughter who got the scholarships, the sister who covered the bills, the person who made sure the taxes were filed and the gutters were cleaned. And in exchange, I was a ghost in my own life, someone whose survival was seen as an inconvenience to my brother's dinner schedule. I thought about the $1,200 monthly allowance my parents pressured me to give Brandon, money that supposedly went toward his business ventures, but actually disappeared into digital poker chips and premium subscriptions. I thought about the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe my father drove, a vehicle he'd bought with the inheritance money that was supposed to be split between us but was invested in his name because I already had a good job. "The Wagyu is in the fridge," I said quietly, my voice devoid of any emotion. I watched his face light up with a smirk of victory, the look of a predator who knew exactly how to make his prey submit. He didn't say thank you. He didn't offer to help me up. He just turned his back and started heading toward the stairs. "Make sure the buns are toasted this time," he called out over his shoulder. "And don't forget the Himalayan sea salt." I gripped the armrest of the sofa, the fabric rough under my fingertips. I didn't get up to cook. I didn't go to the laundry room. I reached for my iPhone 15 Pro, which was sitting on the coffee table next to a bottle of high-strength ibuprofen and a discharge summary that listed my condition as guarded. With trembling fingers, I opened my banking app. I looked at the joint account I had foolishly kept open with my parents for emergencies, the account they used to funnel my earnings to Brandon whenever he had a bad run at the table. There was $4,200 in that account, money I had earmarked for my upcoming specialized certification in cardiovascular surgery. I watched the screen, my thumb hovering over the transfer button. I looked at the basement door, hearing the muffled sounds of Brandon's gaming headset, the aggressive clicks of his mouse, the way he laughed as he told someone on the other end of the line that his maid was back from her vacation. The injustice of it felt like a physical weight, heavier than the pain in my abdomen. I had spent my life caring for others, ensuring that every person who crossed my path was stitched back together, healed and whole. But who was stitching me back together? Who was looking at the 24-year-old girl who had stared into the abyss of septic shock and decided she was worth saving? Not my father, who was probably at the 19th hole of his golf club right now, ordering a $25 steak and complaining about the humidity. Not my mother, who had spent the last 20 years making excuses for a son who was a black hole of need. And certainly not Brandon, who saw my near-death experience as nothing more than a 96-hour delay in his laundry cycle. I closed my eyes for a second, the smell of the Wagyu burgers he wanted me to cook wafting through my mind. I thought about the price of those burgers, $14. It was a small amount, a drop in the ocean of the thousands I had spent on him over the years. But it was the final straw. It was the specific, hyper-realistic detail of his cruelty that broke the spell. He didn't just want food, he wanted the most expensive food, prepared exactly to his liking by a woman who was literally struggling to hold her own body together. I tapped the screen. I transferred every cent out of that joint account and into my private savings at a different bank. Then, I opened my laptop and logged into the utility portal for the house. Water, electricity, high-speed fiber optic internet, all in my name. All paid for by the hours I spent in a mask and gown, breathing in the smell of cauterized flesh and antiseptic. Family is supposed to be the safety net that catches you when you fall. It is supposed to be the hand that holds yours in the recovery room and the voice that tells you to rest because you've done enough. But I realized then that family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out. And the truth was, I was alone in that house with a parasite. I looked at the stairs, feeling the sharp, stinging pull of my staples. I wasn't going to the kitchen. I wasn't going to the laundry room. I was going to my bedroom, and I was going to lock the door. Tomorrow, the locks on the outside of the house would be changed by a locksmith who charged $350 for an emergency Sunday call. Tomorrow, the internet would be disconnected. Tomorrow, the misunderstood genius in the basement would find out exactly what happens when the servant he took for granted finally stops serving. But for now, I just sat there in the fading Seattle light, the gray clouds pressing against the windows of my beautiful, expensive, lonely home. I was Cassidy Miller, and I had survived the surgeon's knives and the poison in my blood. I would survive this, too. The burgers would stay in the fridge, the laundry would rot in the basket, and for the first time in my life, I was going to let myself be the person who mattered most. The contrast between our lives was not just visible, it was sickening, a physical weight that pressed against my chest every time I turned the key in the lock of my own front door. I lived in a 620-square-foot apartment in Scranton, Pennsylvania, a space that felt increasingly like a cramped storage unit for my brother's ego rather than a sanctuary for a working professional. I paid $1,450 a month in rent, plus another $210 for utilities that seemed to spike every month because Jaxson kept the heat cranked to 75 degrees while he sat around in his boxers. To afford this, I worked 60 hours a week as a lead surgical scrub nurse, often picking up the 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. graveyard shifts because the night differential pay was the only thing keeping me from drowning in debt. While I was scrubbing in for emergency appendectomies and orthopedic repairs, my brother, Jaxson, who is 28 years old and possesses the work ethic of a decorative houseplant, was busy being a lifestyle influencer with exactly $0 in actual income. He spent his days draped in a $450 Stone Island hoodie, a garment that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, recording vacuous TikTok videos in my living room, using my $1,200 West Elm velvet sofa as a backdrop for his manufactured reality. I drove a 2012 Honda Civic in a faded, polished metal metallic finish, a car with 142,000 miles on the odometer that groaned every time I accelerated onto the central Scranton Expressway. The driver's side window motor was failing, and the upholstery smelled faintly of the industrial-grade antiseptic I couldn't seem to wash off my skin, but it was mine, and I had paid for every mile of its life. Meanwhile, Jackson's existence was entirely subsidized by the people he treated with the most contempt. My parents, Bill and Martha Miller, enabled him with a devotion that bordered on the pathological. They lived in a neatly manicured colonial in the Green Ridge neighborhood, where my father spent his weekends polishing his 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, a $75,000 beast of a vehicle that he drove to his executive job at a local manufacturing plant. They viewed Jaxson not as a failure, but as a misunderstood creative who just needed a little more time to find his niche in the digital economy. When Jaxson lost his job at a mid-sized logistics firm in Pittston, my parents called me in a state of orchestrated panic. They told me he was a victim of corporate restructuring and that the industry was just too volatile for someone with his vision. The truth, which I found out later from a former co-worker of his, was that he had been fired for a 14% attendance rate because he couldn't be bothered to wake up before noon for a 9 a.m. shift. My mother cried on the phone, her voice trembling with that specific brand of guilt she used as a weapon, and pressured me into letting him stay in my spare room for 2 weeks. She said it was just a temporary bridge until he secured his next high-level position. Those 2 weeks, however, metastasized into 14 grueling months of parasitic entitlement. During those 14 months, Jaxson transformed my home into his personal production studio and landfill. He didn't just stay in the spare room, he colonized the entire 620 square feet. My kitchen, which I used to keep meticulously clean, became a graveyard of takeout containers and half-empty energy drinks. He insisted on eating the $200 weekly groceries I bought from the local Wegmans, items like organic bison, imported avocados, and cold brew coffee that cost $8 a bottle, while never contributing a single cent toward the bill. I would come home after a 12-hour shift, my legs aching and my mind reeling from the sights of the operating theater, only to find him standing in the kitchen, complaining that I had bought the wrong brand of Greek yogurt. He refused to wash even a single $8 IKEA Fergklar plate, leaving them in the sink until the food crust turned into a cement-like substance that required a chisel to remove. I remember one specific Tuesday evening in November, the Scranton sky a bruised purple and the temperature dropping toward freezing. I had just finished a grueling case, a multi-car pileup on I-81 that had kept us in the OR for 6 hours straight. I was exhausted. My back felt like it was being compressed by a hydraulic press, and all I wanted was to heat up the lasagna I'd prepped on Sunday. When I walked through the door, the apartment was blazing with light. Jaxson had set up 3 different ring lights in the middle of the kitchen, their harsh white glow reflecting off the granite-style laminate countertops. He was wearing a new pair of $220 Nike Air Jordan 1s, which I later found out my mother had bought him as a motivation gift, and was currently filming a video about how to maintain a high-performance morning routine. The hypocrisy of it was staggering. He was filming a tutorial on productivity while living off the labor of a woman who was currently clutching a bottle of extra-strength ibuprofen just to stand upright. I looked toward the sink and saw the pile of dishes reaching toward the faucet, including my favorite ceramic mug that was now stained with the dregs of a smoothie he hadn't finished. The smell of his expensive cologne, a $180 bottle of Creed Aventus, clashed with the lingering scent of the fried onions he'd cooked and left on the stove. I stood there in my salt-stained boots, feeling like an intruder in the space I worked myself to the bone to maintain. "Can you move, Cass? You're blocking the natural light from the window," he snapped, not even looking away from the screen of his iPhone 15 Pro Max. He didn't ask how my day was. He didn't notice the bloodstain on my shoe that I hadn't had the energy to scrub off. He only saw me as a shadow in his shot, a minor inconvenience in his quest for digital relevance. I looked at the Stone Island logo on his arm, that compass patch that supposedly signified a world traveler, and I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. I thought about my bank account, which currently held $432 after I had paid the mortgage and the internet bill that Jaxson used to upload his 4-gigabyte video files. My parents had called me the night before to tell me that I needed to be more patient with him, that he was on the verge of something big, and that I shouldn't bring up the dishes because it stifled his creative flow. They were paying for his $150 monthly cell phone plan and his $95 gym membership at the high-end fitness center downtown, yet they expected me to provide the roof, the food, and the maid service. I walked past the ring lights, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor, and went into the bathroom. I looked at myself in the mirror, the dark circles under my eyes, the way my skin looked sallow under the fluorescent lights. I was 24 years old, a lead surgical scrub nurse who held the lives of patients in my hands every single day. Yet I was allowing myself to be treated like an invisible servant by a man who didn't know how to operate a dishwasher. The contrast wasn't just sickening anymore, it was a revelation. It was the moment I realized that I wasn't being a good sister or a supportive daughter. I was being a host for a parasite that had no intention of ever leaving. Every time I tried to set a boundary, my mother would remind me of how blessed I was to have a stable career. She would say, "Cassidy, you have so much, and your brother is struggling. It's the least you can do for family." But family isn't a one-way street of exploitation. Family isn't supposed to leave you sitting in your 2012 Honda Civic in the hospital parking lot, crying because you're too tired to go home and face the mess your brother made. I realized that my parents didn't want Jaxson to succeed. They wanted him to be someone else's problem. By forcing him onto me, they could maintain their perfect image in Bellevue while I dealt with the reality of his failure in Scranton. I sat on the edge of my bathtub, the cold porcelain soaking through my scrubs, and I made a list in my head. $1,450 for rent, $210 for utilities, $800 a month for his groceries and the supplements he insisted he needed for his fitness content. That was nearly $2,500 a month I was spending to facilitate his delusion. Over 14 months, that was $35,000. Money that could have been a down payment on a house, a new car, or the peace of mind I so desperately craved. I thought about the $14 Wagyu burgers he demanded I cook after my surgery, a moment of cruelty so specific it had acted as a catalyst for my change of heart. As I sat there, I heard him laugh from the other room, a loud, performative sound intended for his followers. He was telling them about the importance of curating your environment for success. I looked at the $8 IKEA plate sitting on the bathroom counter, which he'd used to hold a sandwich and then abandoned, and I felt the last shred of my misplaced loyalty snap. I wasn't going to be the silent provider anymore. I wasn't going to be the person who facilitated a lifestyle that was built on my exhaustion. The 2023 Lunar Silver Metallic Honda Civic I would eventually buy, the surgical certifications I would earn, and the life I would build would all be for me. Family is the person who stays when the truth comes out, but sometimes the truth is that the people you love are the ones holding the knife. I stood up, wiped my eyes, and walked out of the bathroom. Jaxson didn't even look up as I passed him. He was too busy checking his likes, too busy admiring his own reflection in the ring light. He had no idea that the 14-month, 2-week stay was about to come to a very expensive and very permanent end. I was Cassidy Miller, and I was done paying for a lifestyle I wasn't allowed to live. I was done being the foundation for a brother who didn't even know how to hold a shovel. The 620-square-foot apartment was about to get a lot emptier, and for the first time in over a year, I felt like I could finally breathe. The betrayal reached its absolute jagged peak on a Tuesday afternoon at exactly 4:22 p.m., a moment frozen in my mind like a frame of high-definition security footage that I can never unsee. I had just been discharged from General Mercy Hospital in Scranton, Pennsylvania, after surviving the most harrowing physical ordeal of my life, a grade 4 ruptured appendix that had nearly turned into a death sentence. My body felt like it had been surgically dismantled and stitched back together by a blind man using rusted wire, and my abdominal incision was currently held together by 14 heavy stainless steel staples that tugged painfully against my skin with every shallow, guarded breath I took. My best friend, Adrian, who stands 6 feet 4 inches tall and works as a construction foreman with hands as rough as sandpaper but a heart of absolute gold, was the only reason I was even able to make it from the hospital doors to the parking lot. He was carrying my heavy medical bag, filled with gauze, saline flushes, and the high-dose antibiotics I needed to keep the sepsis from returning, and he was walking with a slow, deliberate pace to match my own agonizingly small steps. We arrived at my 620-square-foot apartment on Mulberry Street, a place that should have been my sanctuary for recovery, but the moment the heavy oak door swung open, the smell of rotting takeout and unwashed laundry hit us like a physical blow to the face. The air was thick with the scent of rancid grease from abandoned McDonald's bags and the metallic tang of old soda cans that had been left to fester on the coffee table. Jaxson didn't even bother to turn his head or look up from his $500 PlayStation 5. His eyes glued to the 65-inch LG OLED TV that I was still paying off on a monthly installment plan. The only greeting I received after 4 days in a hospital bed was the aggressive clicking of his controller and the sight of his Stone Island hoodie bunched up around his neck. Without even pausing his game, he barked out a demand for dinner, his voice dripping with a casual, practiced arrogance that made my stomach churn even more than the lingering anesthesia. He told me he was starving and called me lazy for walking so slowly across the hardwood floor, complaining that I was taking forever to get through the doorway and was blocking his peripheral vision of the screen. When Adrian, who had seen me at my absolute lowest in the ICU, stepped forward with his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack, Jaxson actually let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the cramped living room. He looked at this massive man, a man who builds skyscrapers and manages crews of 30, and said with a sickening smirk that she is my sister. She is built to serve me, and Mom said so herself. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement in his voice was a revelation of the poison that my parents had been feeding him his entire life. He truly believed that my existence was a secondary function of his own, that my professional career, my health, and my survival were merely footnotes in the story of his manufactured influencer lifestyle. As if the universe wanted to drive the point home with surgical precision, my iPhone 15 Pro buzzed in my trembling hand at that exact second, displaying a new text message from my mother, Martha. I looked down at the screen, my eyes blurring as I read her words. "Don't upset Jaxson. He's stressed about his follower count dropping after that last post. Just make him a sandwich and let him focus. He needs a win right now." My mother, the woman who had supposedly raised me to be a strong, independent woman, was actively instructing me to ignore my own post-surgical agony to cater to the bruised ego of a 28-year-old man who couldn't even manage a 14% attendance rate at a basic logistics job. I stood there, clutching a pillow against my stomach to keep the 14 staples from ripping out of my flesh, and I looked at the contrast between the two men in the room. There was Adrian, who had spent his lunch breaks for the last 4 days sitting in a plastic chair in my hospital room just so I wouldn't be alone. And there was Jaxson, who was wearing $200 Nike Air Jordans I had paid for, demanding a sandwich while I was literally bleeding through my bandages. The realization of the betrayal wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a cold, crystalline hardening of my soul. I realized that my parents didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as a high-yield savings account that they could draw from whenever their favorite child ran into trouble. They saw my nursing degree not as an achievement of my hard work and intelligence, but as a convenient source of funding for Jackson's delusions. The room felt smaller than ever, the 620 square feet pressing in on me like a vice. I looked at the ring lights Jaxson had set up in my kitchen, the $1,200 velvet sofa covered in his dirty gym clothes, and the sink overflowing with plates that cost $8 each, but were now coated in dried-on filth. Every single object in this apartment was a testament to my labor, and every single object was being disrespected by a man who had never earned a cent of his own. Jaxson finally paused his game, his character standing still on the screen, and he turned around with a look of genuine irritation on his face, as if my presence as a recovering patient was a personal affront to his peace. He told me that if I didn't get started on the food soon, he'd have to tell Mom that I was being difficult again, a threat he used like a blunt instrument because he knew she would call me and scream for hours until I gave in. But he didn't realize that the girl who used to give in had died in that ICU bed. The girl who cared about keeping the peace had been replaced by a woman who had seen the inside of her own body and understood exactly how fragile life was. I wasn't going to spend another second of my borrowed time serving a parasite who looked at my surgical scars and saw an inconvenience. Adrian looked at me, his eyes asking for permission to toss Jaxson out the window, but I shook my head slowly, the movement sending a ripple of pain through my abdomen. I didn't need a protector to fight my battles. I needed to be the one to end them. I looked at my brother, the lifestyle influencer with zero income and a $450 hoodie, and I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a profound, icy pity. I reached out and took the medical bag from Adrian, my fingers brushing against the heavy canvas. I wasn't going to make a sandwich. I wasn't going to wash a single plate. I was going to go into my bedroom, lock the door with the deadbolt I'd installed myself, and I was going to begin the process of dismantling the life he had stolen from me. The $1,450 rent, the $210 utility bill, the $200 weekly groceries, all of it was about to vanish from his reality like a dream upon waking. My mother's text message remained on the screen, a digital artifact of a family dynamic that was now officially extinct. "Just make him a sandwich," she had said. As I turned my back on Jaxson and began the long, painful trek toward my bedroom, I realized that this was the last time any of them would ever have the power to tell me what to do. I was Cassidy Miller, lead surgical scrub nurse, and I was finally going to operate on my own life. I was going to cut out the rot, remove the toxins, and stitch myself back together on my own terms. The contrast was no longer sickening. It was a clear map of exactly where I needed to go. And for the first time since my appendix burst, I felt like I could see the light at the end of the hallway. The betrayal was complete, but so was my resolve. I was done being the foundation for a house built on lies, and if Jaxson wanted a sandwich, he was going to have to figure out how to pay for the bread himself. As I closed my bedroom door and heard the click of the lock, I felt a strange sense of peace. The PlayStation continued to beep in the other room, a sound that usually triggered a wave of anxiety in me, but now it just sounded like a countdown to the moment the internet would be cut off, the moment the bank accounts would be frozen, and the moment the 2-week stay would finally reach its 14-month conclusion. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and the truth in that room was that Adrian was more of a brother to me than Jaxson would ever be. I sat on my bed, clutching my stomach, and waited for the morning to come, knowing that the Tuesday at 4:22 p.m. wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of my freedom. I would survive the 14 staples, I would survive the sepsis, and most importantly, I would survive the people who were supposed to love me but only knew how to take. My life was no longer for sale, and the price of my service had just become more than they could ever afford to pay. That night, the physical world seemed to shrink down to the 4 walls of my small, tiled bathroom, the only room in my 620-square-foot apartment that possessed a functioning deadbolt and offered even a semblance of sanctuary from the toxic atmosphere permeating the rest of my home. I sat on the cold, hexagonal white tiles of the floor, leaning my back against the porcelain base of the bathtub because the pain from my 14 surgical staples made sitting on a traditional chair impossible. The air in the bathroom was quiet, isolated from the muffled, aggressive sounds of Jackson's PlayStation 5 shouting from the living room and the faint scent of his expensive Creed Aventus cologne drifting under the door. I reached into the side pocket of my leather work bag and pulled out a small gold-embossed notepad I had kept from a nursing conference at the Ritz-Carlton in Philadelphia last year. A stark and elegant contrast to the squalor my brother was creating just 20 feet away. My hands were still trembling from the adrenaline and the lingering effects of the sepsis that had nearly claimed my life just 96 hours prior. But as I uncapped a black felt-tip pen, my focus became as sharp and cold as a surgical scalpel. I drew a single, uncompromising vertical line down the center of the creamy white paper, dividing my life into a ledger of exploitation that I was finally ready to audit with clinical precision. On the left side of that line, I began to tally the cold, hard numbers of my own destruction, starting with the $1,450 monthly rent that I paid in full while Jaxson occupied the master bedroom and converted my living room into a digital playground. I added the $210 average monthly utility bills, the $150 high-speed fiber optic internet he required for his lifestyle influencer uploads, and the staggering $800 I spent every single month on groceries that I rarely got to eat because he would consume them before I returned from my 12-hour shifts at the hospital. When I totaled the numbers for the last 14 months, the figure that stared back at me was $22,400, a small fortune that represented hundreds of hours of my life spent in a sterile operating room, standing on my feet until my ankles swelled, all to subsidize a man who didn't even have the decency to wash a single $8 IKEA plate. On the right side of the paper, I wrote a single, lonely digit, 0. That was the amount of respect I had received, the amount of gratitude I had been shown, and the amount of concern my brother or my parents had expressed for the fact that I had nearly died on an operating table while they were worried about social media engagement and follower counts. I looked at that paper, the ink still wet under the harsh glare of the fluorescent bathroom vanity lights, and I realized with a bone-deep clarity that blood is not a contract for slavery, and having the same DNA does not give another human being the right to strip you of your dignity and your financial security. I reached for the small orange plastic bottle of generic ibuprofen I had purchased for $3.50 at a local pharmacy, the cheap white pills being the only thing standing between me and a level of physical agony I didn't want to contemplate, and the sheer pettiness of my situation hit me like a physical wave. I was a lead surgical scrub nurse, a woman entrusted with the most delicate instruments in modern medicine, yet I was sitting on a bathroom floor hiding from my own brother because I was too weak to defend my own space. The realization was a turning point, a surgical excision of the guilt that my mother, Martha, had spent 24 years sewing into my psyche with her constant reminders that family comes first and that I was the strong one who had to carry the weak. I looked at the $22,400 figure again and saw it for what it truly was. Not a gift of love, but a ransom payment for a peace that never actually arrived. I wasn't just tired. I was finished being the family's safety net, the person everyone called when they needed money or a place to stay or someone to blame for their own failures. I thought about my father, Bill, and his 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country, a $75,000 symbol of his success that he refused to use to help his own son because it was easier to let me bear the burden in my cramped Scranton apartment. I thought about my mother's text message telling me to just make a sandwich for a man who had just insulted my very existence while I was clutching my surgical staples in pain. The injustice of it was so concentrated, so pure, that it acted as a catalyst, transforming my exhaustion into a cold, calculated resolve that I had never felt before. I didn't need a brother who viewed me as a servant, and I didn't need parents who viewed me as a utility company. What I needed was an eviction lawyer who could navigate the labyrinthine housing laws of Pennsylvania and help me remove the parasite that was currently eating my life from the inside out. The silence of the bathroom was broken only by the occasional drip of the faucet and the distant, rhythmic clicking of Jackson's gaming controller, a sound that usually filled me with a sense of dread, but now only served to reinforce my decision. I took my iPhone 15 Pro out of my pocket and began to search for the highest-rated tenant-landlord attorneys in the Scranton area, ignoring the 3 missed calls from my mother that were lighting up the screen. I knew that the moment I took this step, the facade of the happy Miller family would shatter into a million jagged pieces, and I would be cast as the villain in their manufactured narrative of sisterly betrayal. They would call me heartless. They would say I was abandoning my brother in his time of need, and they would conveniently forget the $22,400 and the 14 staples holding my abdomen together. But as I sat on that cold floor, looking at the Ritz-Carlton notepad that held the truth of my life, I realized that I would rather be a villain in their story than a victim in my own. I began to draft an email to a law firm downtown, my fingers moving with the same steady precision I used when passing a hemostat to a surgeon in the middle of a crisis. I detailed the 14-month history of Jackson's residency, the lack of any rental agreement, and the verbal abuse and financial exploitation that had characterized his stay in my home. I looked at the ibuprofen bottle again, realizing that the $3.50 I spent on it was more of an investment in my future than any cent I had ever given to Jaxson. My life was no longer going to be a series of concessions and apologies for my own success. It was going to be a fortress that I defended with everything I had. I spent the next hour in that locked bathroom, not crying or lamenting my fate, but planning the logistics of my liberation with the meticulousness of a military operation. I calculated the cost of changing the locks, the legal fees required for a formal eviction notice, and the price of a storage unit where I could dump the $450 Stone Island hoodies and the PlayStation 5 the moment the law allowed me to do so. The contrast between the girl who had entered this apartment 4 hours ago, trembling and broken, and the woman sitting on the floor now was absolute. I realized that the sepsis hadn't just cleared the toxins from my blood. It had cleared the fog from my mind, allowing me to see the people in my life for who they actually were instead of who I wanted them to be. Family isn't the people who share your blood. Family is the people who show up with a medical bag and a steady hand when you're too weak to stand, like Adrian, who was still sitting on my sofa in the other room, a silent sentinel against my brother's entitlement. I stood up slowly, the staples in my skin giving a sharp, warning tug, and I looked at my reflection in the vanity mirror. My face was pale, my eyes were shadowed, but there was a flicker of something new behind the pupils, a cold, hard light that told me I was finally ready to fight for myself. I folded the Ritz-Carlton notepad and tucked it back into my bag, a physical record of the night I decided to stop being a servant and start being a survivor. I knew that tomorrow would bring a storm of phone calls, tears from my mother and threats from my father, but as I turned off the bathroom light and stepped back out into the hallway, I felt a strange and powerful sense of peace. The ledger was closed, the audit was complete, and the balance was overwhelmingly in my favor. I walked past the living room, where Jaxson was still shouting at a television screen about a game that didn't matter, and I didn't say a word. I didn't need to explain myself to him anymore because the conversation was over. The $22,400 was gone, an expensive lesson in the cost of misplaced loyalty, but the future was mine to reclaim. I was Cassidy Miller, a lead surgical scrub nurse who had survived a grade 4 rupture and the betrayal of her own kin, and I was about to show my brother exactly what happens when the safety net is pulled away. The eviction lawyer would be my next surgical tool, and the result would be a life that was finally, truly, and completely my own. The next morning at exactly 9 a.m., the cold Pennsylvania sun was cutting through the gray mist of Scranton as I pulled my 2012 Honda Civic into a metered parking spot in front of a prestigious professional building downtown. My body was a roadmap of exhaustion and physical trauma, the 14 stainless steel staples in my abdomen pulling sharply against my skin with every movement. But my mind was clearer than it had been in the 14 months since Jaxson moved into my life. I had an appointment with Mr. Sterling, a man whose reputation as a ruthless real estate attorney preceded him in every legal circle from Wilkes-Barre to Philadelphia. Walking into his suite was like stepping into a different world. The air was heavy with the scent of expensive mahogany furniture, old leather-bound law books, and the sharp, acidic aroma of $90 an ounce espresso that he sipped from a delicate white porcelain cup. The office was quiet, a stark contrast to the cacophony of video game explosions and TikTok soundtracks that had defined my home life. And for the first time in over a year, I felt like the person in control of the room. I sat down in a heavy green leather chair that cost more than my car, moving slowly to avoid aggravating my incision, and placed a thick, legal-sized manila folder on his polished desk. This folder was the culmination of a sleepless night spent auditing the wreckage of my finances and my trust. Inside, I had meticulously organized 12 months of bank statements from my primary checking account at PNC Bank, each line item highlighted in neon yellow where Jaxson had drained my resources. I pointed out the recurring charges for DoorDash deliveries from high-end spots like the Metropolitan and State Street Grill, totaling a staggering $4,820 for meals I never tasted and convenience fees I never authorized. I showed him the copy of my residential lease agreement for the apartment on Mulberry Street, a document that clearly and indisputably listed only one name under the heading of tenant Cassidy Miller. There was no mention of a brother, no sublease agreement, and no legal provision that allowed a 28-year-old lifestyle influencer to occupy the space without contribution or consent. The most damning piece of evidence, however, was a silver USB drive containing 48 hours of Nest camera footage from the living room. While I had been lying in a bed at General Mercy Hospital with a drainage tube in my side and my blood pressure plummeting from septic shock, Jaxson hadn't been worrying about my survival or checking in with my doctors. The footage showed him hosting a series of loud, chaotic parties for his content creator friends, people who sat on my $1,200 West Elm velvet sofa and spilled cheap vodka on my rugs while Jaxson bragged about his bachelor pad. I watched on the small screen of Mr. Sterling's laptop as my brother laughed, wearing my headphones and eating the expensive organic snacks I'd bought before my collapse, treating my home like a rented venue while I fought for my life only 3 miles away. Mr. Sterling watched the footage in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When he finally looked up, he didn't offer the hollow platitudes of family first that I had heard from my mother, Martha, or the dismissive grunts I expected from my father, Bill. Instead, he smiled. A cold, calculated $350 per hour smile that made me realize I had finally brought a gun to a knife fight. He told me that a standard eviction was too gentle for a case of this magnitude. He explained that we weren't just going to file for a formal notice to quit, but we were going to hit him with a civil suit for unjust enrichment. This legal strategy was designed to recover the fair market value of the housing, utilities, and luxuries Jaxson had siphoned from me under the false pretense of a temporary stay. We were going to hold him personally and financially accountable for the $22,400 I had calculated on my Ritz-Carlton notepad the night before, and we were going to do it with the full weight of the Pennsylvania judicial system behind us. The air in the office felt energized, charged with the thrill of a counterattack. Mr. Sterling began drafting the initial filings on his computer, the rhythmic clicking of his mechanical keyboard sounding like a drumbeat of war. He noted the $4,820 in unauthorized food charges as a separate count of conversion, a legal term for personal property theft, and added the $1,450 monthly rent as the baseline for the restitution we would seek. I sat there, clutching my $3.50 bottle of ibuprofen, and felt the weight of 14 months of silence lifting off my shoulders. I thought about the $450 Stone Island hoodie Jaxson was likely wearing at that very moment, blissfully unaware that his world was about to be dismantled by a man who didn't care about his follower count or his creative flow. "We will serve him at the property tomorrow morning," Mr. Sterling said, his voice as smooth and lethal as a silk cord. He explained that by filing the civil suit alongside the eviction, we were effectively freezing Jackson's ability to claim he was simply a guest. We were defining him as a debtor. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. For 24 years, I had been the one who fixed things, the one who scrubbed in and cleaned up the messes left by other people's negligence. Now, I was the one performing the surgery, and I was going to ensure that every toxic element of my brother's presence was excised from my life. I paid the $1,500 retainer fee with a steady hand, watching the transaction clear on my phone and knowing that this was the best money I had ever spent. It wasn't just a fee for legal services, it was the price of my own liberation. As I left the office, the mahogany and espresso scent lingering on my clothes, I felt a strange sense of detachment from the girl I used to be. That girl would have worried about where Jaxson would go or how my parents would react to the news of a lawsuit. That girl would have felt guilty for using her hard-earned money to attack her own flesh and blood. But as I walked toward my 2012 Honda Civic, feeling the sharp tug of my surgical staples, I realized that Jaxson hadn't been acting like flesh and blood when I was in the ICU. He had been a predator, and my parents had been his enablers. My mother's recent text, telling me to just make a sandwich while I was bleeding, was the final piece of evidence I needed to realize that the family I was trying to protect didn't actually exist. They were a collective of people who used my strength to hide their own weaknesses, and I was done being the foundation for their dysfunction. I got into my car, the interior smelling of the hospital-grade antiseptic that seemed to be a permanent part of my identity, and I didn't head home. I didn't want to see Jackson's face or hear the aggressive clicks of his PlayStation 5. Instead, I drove to a quiet park overlooking the Susquehanna River and sat there for an hour, watching the water flow toward the Chesapeake. I thought about the $22,400, a sum that represented so many missed birthdays, so many double shifts, and so much ignored exhaustion. In Mr. Sterling's office, those numbers had become weapons. In my hands, they had been chains. I looked at the manila folder on the passenger seat, the physical manifestation of my resolve, and I felt a profound, quiet power. Tomorrow, the process would begin. Tomorrow, a process server would knock on the door of my 620-square-foot apartment and hand Jaxson a reality he couldn't swipe away or edit for his followers. He would find out that the Maid had retired and the bank was closed. He would find out that in the real world, the one where I spent 12 hours a day saving lives in a sterile OR, there are consequences for being a parasite. I was Cassidy Miller, lead surgical scrub nurse, and I had just hired a professional to help me finish the job the surgeons started. I was cutting the rot out of my life, and for the first time since my appendix burst, I wasn't afraid of the scars that would be left behind. I was looking forward to them, because each scar would be a reminder that I fought for myself and won. The mahogany-scented office of Mr. Sterling was the theater, and the operation was now officially underway. There would be no more sandwiches, no more $14 Wagyu burgers, and no more silence. The contrast between our lives was about to become a chasm, and I was finally on the right side of the divide. The trap was set for Saturday night, a cold and unforgiving evening in Scranton, where the wind chill factor had dropped the temperature to a piercing 32 degrees, sending frost creeping across the edges of my apartment windows. Inside my 620-square-foot home, however, the atmosphere was a grotesque display of artificial heat and forced glamour, as Jaxson had decided to host a VIP launch party for his new personal brand, a venture that existed solely in the realm of his digital delusions. He had spent the afternoon treating my living room like a film set, rearranging my furniture and setting up high-intensity ring lights that cast a clinical, blinding glow over the space I worked so hard to maintain. To top off the audacity of his performance, he had attempted to purchase $600 worth of Moet and Chandon champagne at a local upscale liquor store using the emergency credit card I keep in my kitchen drawer, a card he had stolen while I was undergoing emergency surgery. I had received the notification on my phone at 2 p.m. and immediately reported the transaction as fraudulent, watching with a cold sense of satisfaction as the bank froze the account. Yet Jaxson had somehow managed to procure the bottles anyway, likely by begging my mother, Martha, for yet another infusion of startup capital. By 8:15 p.m., the apartment was crawling with 12 of his so-called VIP friends, a collection of aspiring influencers and hangers-on who were currently draping themselves over my $1,200 West Elm velvet sofa and leaning against my pristine kitchen counters with an air of unearned ownership. The air was thick with the cloying scent of cheap hairspray, expensive cologne, and the humid breath of a dozen people crowded into a space designed for one. They were all holding their iPhone 15 Pros at various angles, filming behind-the-scenes content and get-ready-with-me snippets, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman who paid the $1,450 monthly rent was standing just outside the door. I took a final moment in the hallway to steady my breathing, feeling the 14 stainless steel staples in my abdomen give a sharp, warning tug as I adjusted my posture. I wasn't the tired, broken nurse in salt-stained scrubs who had crawled home from the hospital 5 days ago. I was a woman who had reclaimed her own narrative. I was wearing a sharp, structured $300 Zara blazer in midnight black that hid my bandages and gave me a silhouette of professional authority, and in my right hand, I held 13 thick, white legal envelopes that felt heavier than lead. I pushed the door open and walked into the center of the room, my heels clicking with a lethal, rhythmic precision against the hardwood floor. The music, some bass-heavy lo-fi track meant to signify luxury vibes, was still thumping, and for a few seconds, no one noticed me. Jaxson was standing near the window, wearing his $450 Stone Island hoodie and holding a gold-rimmed glass of champagne, laughing at something a girl in a sequined top was saying. He looked at me for a split second, his expression shifting from annoyance to a smug sort of triumph, as if he expected me to slink away to the kitchen and start prepping appetizers for his guests. He didn't see the envelopes, and he certainly didn't see the cold, surgical fire in my eyes that mirrored the $350 per hour smile of Mr. Sterling. The contrast between the shivering, 32-degree night outside and the suffocating arrogance inside was about to be obliterated by a truth that no amount of social media filtering could fix. I didn't wait for him to speak or for the music to stop. I stepped directly into the path of a ring light, effectively killing the shot that one of his friends was trying to film. The room began to quiet as the guests realized that the maid had returned, but she wasn't carrying a tray of Wagyu burgers. "The party is over," I said, my voice projecting with the same calm, undeniable command I used when a patient's vitals began to crash in the operating room. I looked at the 12 strangers in my home, people who had benefited from my labor without ever knowing my name, and I began to distribute the envelopes. Each one was addressed to one of his VIPs, and inside was a formal notice of trespass and a copy of the civil suit for unjust enrichment that listed them as potential witnesses to Jackson's unauthorized use of the property. I watched their faces turn from confusion to genuine fear as they realized they were being handed legal documents in the middle of a champagne toast. When I reached Jaxson, I didn't hand him an envelope. I dropped it on the floor at his feet, right next to his $220 Nike Air Jordans. The 13 envelopes were a message, a physical manifestation of the $22,400 he had drained from my life over the last 14 months. My brother stared at the white paper, his face flushing a deep, angry red that clashed with the designer lighting. He tried to laugh, to play it off for his followers who were still holding their phones up, recording the most authentic content they had ever seen. He called me crazy, his voice cracking as he reached for the envelope and told his friends that I was just stressed from work and making a scene for attention. But as he opened the seal and saw the professional letterhead of Mr. Sterling's law firm, the bravado vanished. He saw the notice to quit and the 30-day countdown to a forced eviction, and he saw the itemized list of $4,820 in DoorDash charges that we were now suing him to recover. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a siren out on the Scranton streets. I stood my ground, the Zara blazer providing a suit of armor against the entitlement that had nearly drowned me. I thought about the $3.50 bottle of ibuprofen, the 2012 Honda Civic with 142,000 miles, and the 96 hours I spent fighting for my life while this man was planning a launch party in my living room. I realized that the 32-degree weather outside was actually warmer than the hearts of the people I had called my family. I looked at Jaxson, who was now trembling with a mixture of rage and humiliation, and I felt nothing but a profound, icy clarity. I wasn't just evicting a tenant, I was removing a parasite that had mistaken my kindness for a weakness and my silence for a surrender. The guests began to scramble, dropping their champagne glasses and grabbing their coats, the VIP status evaporating the moment a legal process server was mentioned. They didn't want to be part of his brand anymore. They wanted to get as far away from the Mulberry Street apartment as possible before the police arrived to enforce the noise complaint I had also filed at 8:10 p.m. Jaxson tried to stop them, his hands reaching out to grab the sleeves of their jackets, but they pushed past him, eager to escape the cold reality that was crashing down on their manufactured world. Within 5 minutes, the room was empty of everyone but me, my brother, and the wreckage of his failed celebration. The $600 worth of champagne sat in a bucket of melting ice, a symbol of a lifestyle that was built on a foundation of theft and supported by a sister who was finally, irrevocably done. "Mom is going to kill you for this, Cassidy," Jaxson hissed, his voice a low, venomous growl as he paced the small space of the living room. "She told you to take care of me. She told you I was the one who was going to make this family famous. You're just a nurse. You're nothing without us." I looked at him and didn't even blink. I realized then that my mother's text about the sandwich and my father's $75,000 Chevrolet Tahoe were all part of the same machinery of exploitation. They didn't want me to be a nurse. They wanted me to be a resource, a silent engine that powered their golden boy's ego so they didn't have to deal with the reality of his failure. But the engine had stopped. The resource had been depleted. And the nurse was now the one holding the scalpel, ready to perform the final necessary cut. I walked over to the front door and held it open, the 32-degree air rushing in and cutting through the stagnant heat of the party. I told him he had until the end of the month to find a new host, and that every single item he had bought with my money, the PlayStation 5, the gaming PC, the Stone Island hoodies, would be listed as assets in the civil suit to recover my $22,400. I watched the realization sink in that I wasn't bluffing, that the maid had officially gone on strike and was now the landlord. I was Cassidy Miller, and I had survived a ruptured appendix, a septic shock, and the betrayal of my own blood. As I stood there in my Zara blazer, watching my brother stare at the legal papers scattered across my floor, I knew that the winter was going to be long and difficult. But for the first time in 14 months, I wasn't afraid of the cold. I was the one who had set the temperature, and I was finally comfortable in my own skin, staples and all. The trap wasn't just set. It had snapped shut, and the only person left standing in the light was me. "Attention, everyone," I said, my voice projecting with a clinical, unwavering steadiness that I had perfected through years of monitoring heart rate monitors in high-stress surgical suites where any sign of tremor signaled a lack of control. Since Jaxson loves an audience so much, and since he has spent the last 14 months curating a digital existence based entirely on the exploitation of my hard work, I thought it was only fair that you all get a real look at the behind-the-scenes of his supposed success. The room, which had been buzzing with the superficial chatter of 12 aspiring influencers and the rhythmic thumping of a lo-fi house track, suddenly plummeted into a vacuum of silence as I began to move through the crowd with the precision of a surgeon. I handed a thick, white legal envelope to every single guest, ensuring that each person who had been sipping the $600 worth of Moët champagne I hadn't authorized felt the weight of the paper in their hands. Inside those envelopes was not a party favor or a promotional flyer for a new brand launch. Instead, each one contained a formal notice to vacate the premises and a meticulously itemized printout of the $22,400 debt Jaxson had accrued while living as a parasite in my 620-square-foot apartment. I had also included a copy of the police report I had filed just hours ago for the fraudulent champagne purchase he made using my emergency credit card while I was recovering from a grade 4 ruptured appendix. The reaction was instantaneous and visceral, a far cry from the filtered and polished reactions they usually posted to their social media stories for their followers to consume. One girl, who had been posing near my $1,200 West Elm velvet sofa in a sequined top, was so startled by the cold reality of the legal documents that she dropped her $15 crystal flute, and it shattered against the dark hardwood floor with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded like a starting pistol. No one moved to help her, and no one offered a witty remark. They were all too busy staring at the numbers on the page. The $1,450 monthly rent, the $4,820 in DoorDash deliveries, and the criminal case number listed at the bottom of the police report. I turned my gaze toward Jaxson, who was standing by the kitchen counter, and I watched as his face turned a specific ashen shade of gray that I have only ever seen in the trauma wards of St. Jude Medical Center when a patient's body finally begins to give up the fight against systemic failure. The arrogance that usually defined his posture had evaporated, replaced by a hollow, trembling shock as he realized that the sister he viewed as an unpaid servant had finally performed the ultimate surgical excision of his lifestyle. I didn't give him the opportunity to mount a defense or to perform another one of his dramatic outbursts for the benefit of the cameras that were still awkwardly held aloft by a few confused guests. I looked him directly in the eye and told him, in a voice that carried the full weight of the $350 per hour authority of Mr. Sterling, that he had exactly 20 minutes to pack his $4,500 custom-built Alienware Aurora R16 gaming PC and whatever clothes he could fit into his designer luggage before he was removed from the property. I informed him that the locksmith, a professional I had paid a $350 emergency weekend fee to, was already waiting in the hallway with a new set of high-security deadbolts and was prepared to change the locks the moment the clock hit 21 minutes. The 32-degree weather outside was beginning to seep through the window frames, a chilling reminder that the world outside my subsidized sanctuary was cold and unforgiving, much like the reality Jaxson was about to be forced to navigate for the first time in his 28 years of existence. The guests began to scramble toward the door, their VIP status dissolving into a frantic desire to avoid being associated with a man who was now legally documented as a debtor and a fraud. They pushed past one another, leaving behind their half-empty glasses and the expensive organic snacks I had paid for, disappearing into the Scranton night without a second glance at the man they had been celebrating moments before. Jaxson tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But no sound came out except for a ragged, desperate breath that hitched in his chest. He looked at the shattered glass on the floor, then at the 13 envelopes scattered around the room like fallen leaves, and finally at me, standing there in my $300 Zara blazer with my arms crossed over my 14 surgical staples. He realized that there would be no more $14 organic Wagyu burgers, no more $150 high-speed fiber-optic internet for his uploads, and no more mother to text me instructions on how to serve him while I was bleeding from an incision. The clock on the wall, a minimalist piece I'd bought to bring some peace to the kitchen, ticked away with a mechanical indifference as Jaxson finally lunged toward his bedroom to start unplugging the glowing cables of his gaming rig. I stood in the center of the living room, the silence now so heavy it felt like a physical presence, and I didn't feel the guilt I had spent my whole life being conditioned to feel by my mother, Martha, and my father, Bill. I thought about the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country my father drove, a vehicle that cost nearly 4 times the debt Jaxson owed me, and I realized that my parents would likely be his next targets for a place to stay. They would have to face the monster they had created, the misunderstood genius who didn't know how to wash an $8 IKEA plate or respect the boundaries of the woman who had spent her youth ensuring his comfort. I looked at the $3.50 bottle of generic ibuprofen on the coffee table, a reminder of my own physical vulnerability, and I felt a surge of strength that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with the absolute reclamation of my own dignity. As Jaxson dragged his heavy PC tower into the hallway, his breathing heavy and his movements clumsy with panic, he stopped at the threshold and looked back at me one last time, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred that didn't even register as a threat to me anymore. He told me that I was dead to the family, that Mom and Dad would never forgive me for throwing him into the street like a dog, and that I would regret the day I decided to choose money over blood. I simply looked at my watch and informed him that he had 4 minutes left, my voice remaining as steady as a heart monitor, even as the person I had shared a childhood with disintegrated before my eyes. I knew that the blood he was talking about was nothing more than a metaphor for the leash he had used to keep me tethered to his needs, and the family he was defending was a collective that had stood by and watched me nearly die of septic shock without ever offering to wash a single dish. The locksmith stepped into the frame then, a burly man with a heavy tool belt that clanked with the sounds of metal and industry, and he began the process of unscrewing the old hardware from my front door. The sound of the drill was the most beautiful music I had heard in 14 months, It was the sound of a border being established, a barrier being built, and a life being reclaimed. Jaxson scrambled to grab his remaining bags, nearly tripping over the broken glass of the crystal flute, and stumbled out into the hallway just as the old lock fell to the floor with a dull thud. I watched through the open doorway as he stood there in the cold 32-degree air, surrounded by his expensive toys and his useless envelopes, a lifestyle influencer with no home and a $22,400 debt hanging over his head like a guillotine. I didn't say goodbye, and I didn't offer him a coat or a ride to a hotel. I simply closed the door and listened for the heavy, satisfying click of the new deadbolt sliding into place. I walked over to the sink, picked up a sponge, and began to wash the single $8 IKEA plate that had been left on the counter, the warm water soothing my hands as I performed the simple, solitary act of cleaning my own home. The $22,400 might never be fully recovered, and the civil suit for unjust enrichment might take months of legal maneuvering with Mr. Sterling. But as I sat down on my gray West Elm sectional sofa and looked at the quiet, empty space of my 620-square-foot apartment, I realized that I had already won the only thing that mattered. I was Cassidy Miller, a lead surgical scrub nurse who had successfully excised the rot from her life, and for the first time in my 24 years, I was the only person who had a seat at my table. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out. And the truth was that I was finally whole, stitched back together by my own hand and my own resolve. The gray shade of the trauma ward was gone, replaced by the warm, golden light of a future that belonged to me and me alone. Jaxson eventually slunk back to the dark, wood-paneled basement of my parents' colonial home in Bellevue. But without the oxygen of my hard-earned funding, his carefully manufactured influencer life evaporated like a shallow mist under a midday sun. The $450 Stone Island hoodies and the $220 Nike Air Jordans were no longer being replenished by my overtime pay at the St. Jude Medical Center, and without the sleek, modern backdrop of my 620-square-foot apartment, his content lacked the aspirational luster his followers craved. The transition was not quiet, however, as my parents, Bill and Martha, launched a final desperate offensive to regain control of the narrative and the bank account I had so decisively closed. Yet my inbox was suddenly flooded with a 1,200-word email from my mother, a masterpiece of manipulative prose that used every weapon in her psychological arsenal, from citing family tradition to accusing me of being the reason for Jackson's supposed mental health decline. She claimed that by evicting him and filing a civil suit for $22,400, I had essentially committed an act of treason against the Miller bloodline, and that my father's 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country would now have to be used to transport Jackson's gaming equipment back to their basement because I was too heartless to provide a roof. I didn't respond with my own long-winded defense or attempt to explain the clinical necessity of my actions. Instead, I took my iPhone 15 Pro and performed a final digital surgery, blocking their numbers, their email addresses, and their social media profiles with a steady, clinical hand. I did, however, send one final communication through Mr. Sterling's office, a formal bill addressed to Bill and Martha Miller for their share of the family's golden boy, detailing the $4,820 in fraudulent DoorDash charges and the $1,450 in monthly rent they had pressured me to cover while they enjoyed their high-end lifestyle in the suburbs. I realized that for 24 years, I had been the silent shareholder in a family corporation that only paid dividends to one person, and I was finally liquidating my interest in their dysfunction. The silence that followed the blocking of their numbers was not hollow. It was a vibrant, expansive peace that allowed me to finally hear the sound of my own thoughts for the first time since my appendix had ruptured. Now, 6 months after the 14 stainless steel staples were removed from my abdomen, leaving a thin, silver reminder of my survival, I live in a home that is as quiet as an empty operating theater and as spotless as a sterile field. The 620-square-foot apartment on Mulberry Street has been replaced by a modest but beautiful townhouse on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood where the only sound at night is the wind in the oaks, rather than the aggressive clicking of a PlayStation 5 controller. My only roommate is a 2-year-old golden retriever named Cooper, a dog with a coat the color of honey and a temperament that provides more emotional support than my biological family ever managed in 2 decades. Cooper doesn't demand $14 organic Wagyu burgers or expect me to wash his $8 IKEA plates after a 12-hour shift. He simply rests his head on my knee while I sit on my gray West Elm sectional, his presence a constant, wordless affirmation that I am worthy of a soft and peaceful life. The financial transformation has been as dramatic as the physical one, as the $2,340 I save every single month by not subsidizing a parasite now flows directly into a diversified early retirement fund and a high-yield savings account. I no longer drive the 2012 Honda Civic with 142,000 miles. I traded it in for a 2024 lunar silver metallic Honda CR-V that doesn't groan when it accelerates and has a seat that supports my back during the long commute to the hospital. Every time I look at my banking app, I don't see the red ink of Jackson's entitlement. I see the black and white reality of my own independence. I cook for myself now, enjoying the process of preparing simple, nutritious meals in a kitchen that stays exactly as clean as I leave it. And the only person I have to consider when I decide to work a double shift or take a weekend off is the woman I see in the mirror. The contrast between the night of the VIP launch party and my life today is absolute. Back then, the air was 32 degrees and my home was a battlefield. Now, the temperature is exactly where I want it to be, and my home is a sanctuary. I thought about the $3.50 bottle of generic ibuprofen that was my only companion on the night I decided to change my life, and I realized that the most important medicine I ever took wasn't a pill or an antibiotic. It was the decision to stop being a safety net for people who were perfectly capable of standing on their own feet but preferred to use mine. I am Cassidy Miller, a lead surgical scrub nurse, and I have learned that the most difficult operations aren't the ones performed with a scalpel under bright LED lights, but the ones performed on your own heart when you have to cut away the people you love to save yourself from drowning in their needs. My parents' 1,200-word email is buried in a spam folder I will never open, and Jackson's digital brand is a ghost town of deleted posts and unanswered comments, a fitting end for a lifestyle that was built on a foundation of theft. They may still tell their friends at the Broadmoor Golf Club that I am the cold, unfeeling daughter who abandoned her family, but I know the truth that is recorded in my ledger and in the scars on my stomach. Family is not a biological obligation that requires you to sacrifice your health, your wealth, and your sanity at the altar of someone else's ego. Family is the person who holds the door open, the person who sits in the ICU chair until the sun comes up, and the dog who waits by the window for you to come home from a long day of saving lives. The $2,340 I save each month is not just money. It is time. It is security. And it is the ability to say no to anyone who views my strength as an invitation to exploit me. I sit in my quiet living room, Cooper at my feet, and I watch the snow fall softly against the glass of my spotless home, feeling the warmth of the fireplace I paid for with my own labor. The 14 staples are long gone, and the sepsis has been cleared from my blood, but the clarity I gained in that hospital bed remains as sharp as ever. I have dismantled the lifestyle of a parasite and built a fortress of my own design. And for the first time in my life, I am not just a nurse or a daughter or a servant. I am a woman who is finally, irrevocably, and beautifully free. I don't need a golden boy to make my family famous. I have my own name, my own career, and a seat at a table where the only guest I have to please is myself. My life is no longer a cautionary tale of exploitation. It is a clinical study in the power of boundaries and the necessity of self-preservation. I have saved my own life, and in the quiet, spotless reality of my new beginning, I have finally found the home I was always meant to live in.